The training ground at Eagle Mesa went silent the moment she said it. 600 soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder around the open combat mat, and not one of them made a sound. "I'm a Navy SEAL," Keira Vale said. Sergeant Rafe Calloway laughed. He grabbed the collar of her uniform in front of the entire base and told her that battlefields weren't built for someone who looked too small to survive one. Keira didn't answer. She just looked at him. When Rafe lunged with an illegal strike moments later, she turned half a step and he went down. But how did she know exactly which move he'd throw and precisely when it was coming? The answer goes back further than that mat, further than that morning, all the way to a conversation the night before, and 30 minutes of quiet, methodical confirmation that most people in that crowd never even noticed. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. Eagle Mesa Joint Training Center sat in the middle of Utah's Red Rock Desert, like a scar carved into the earth. The base was all hard angles and flat, light concrete walls baked pale by the sun. Steel fencing that caught the heat and held it. Unit flags snapping in dry wind that carried nothing but dust. It was not a place that welcomed softness. The Inter-Service Combat Assessment, what the soldiers called Conflict Day, happened once a year. 600 personnel gathered on the outdoor combat mat, enlisted men and women, training officers, senior commanders, and anyone whose rank gave them a reason to watch. It was not a tournament. It was a test. A public one. The kind where reputations were built and occasionally destroyed. Keira Vale had driven in from the highway before dawn. She was 27 years old, 5'6", and carried herself the way people do when they've learned that stillness is not the same as weakness. Her face gave nothing away. Her eyes were the kind of dark that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it. She had been assigned to Eagle Mesa through a special inter-service coordination order, the kind that came with no fanfare and no explanation beyond report and participate. So she did. What made Keira different had nothing to do with size or volume. In her unit, she was known for one thing above everything else. She could read a person's body before they knew what their body was about to do. Shoulder rotation, hip alignment, the half-second a fighter's weight shifted before a strike. She had spent years learning that combat was not a matter of strength meeting strength. It was a matter of timing meeting information. She never entered a fight without already understanding her opponent. That wasn't arrogance. That was discipline. Sergeant Rafe Calloway ran physical training at Eagle Mesa, the way a man runs something he believes belongs to him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had never lost an internal sparring match on this base. A fact that a rotation of younger soldiers treated like scripture. They followed him between drills. They laughed at his jokes before the punchline landed. He had the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously been challenged by anyone he'd decided didn't count. He had decided a long time ago that women didn't count. Not here. Not in a combat environment. He never said it plainly. He didn't need to. It came out in the questions he asked, too loudly, the comments he let land in front of an audience. The way he looked at female personnel like they were a clerical error the base hadn't gotten around to correcting. And there was one other thing about Rafe Calloway that most people on the base had never bothered to document when he was pushed to the edge of losing face. He always loaded his left shoulder before committing to a strike. Not because it was his stronger side, because it was a habit so deep he no longer controlled it. Commander Elise Navarro had submitted Keira's name for the assessment roster herself. She believed, and had argued more than once to people who didn't want to hear it, that Eagle Mesa's definition of capability was too narrow. She had also watched Rafe Calloway spar more times than she could count, and she was the only person on the base who had logged what she saw the left shoulder. Every time. She had shared that observation with exactly one person before the bout. Corporal Mason Ivers was 22. quiet, and stood near the back of the gathered crowd in the way people stand when they've learned that proximity to the wrong person is dangerous. Rafe had made an example of him twice in the past year. Mason didn't speak about it. He just watched and remembered. He had also been standing outside a closed training room 8 months ago and heard things he had not yet found the courage to report. Master Sergeant Orland Pierce ran floor discipline on the combat mat. He was fair by most accounts, though fair at Eagle Mesa had on at least one occasion meant looking the other way when Rafe pushed past the line during a closed training session and a junior soldier left with more than bruises. Pierce had filed nothing. The incident had disappeared into Rafe's record of wins. Colonel Brenna Sykes had arrived the previous afternoon to evaluate Eagle Mesa's updated training curriculum. She sat in the elevated observation area with a legal pad and a pen and watched everything with the focused patience of someone who had learned to see what people were trying to hide. None of them knew, standing there in the early morning heat, that by the following afternoon, everything on this base would shift. Keira arrived at the check-in station with her orders folded in the chest pocket of her uniform. The soldier at the table looked at her, looked at the paperwork, and looked at her again. "You're a participant," he said. "Yes." He wrote her name down without further comment, but his expression said everything he didn't. The assessment was staged in 3 rounds across the day, with the final bout announced at the end of the afternoon. Participants rotated through evaluation stations, hand-to-hand technique, controlled engagement drills, situational response. Keira moved through each one without announcement. She didn't introduce herself to the gathered crowd. She didn't look for acknowledgement. She simply showed up at each station when her name was called and did what she had been trained to do. It was at the second station that Rafe Calloway noticed her. He was standing with a cluster of soldiers near the edge of the mat, not yet scheduled to compete, watching the rotation with the loose posture of a man who considered himself the main event, regardless of the program. He saw Keira take her position across from a male corporal who outweighed her by 60 pounds, and he said loudly enough for the 24 people nearby to hear, "Did she take a wrong turn somewhere?" A few soldiers laughed. Some didn't. Keira heard it. She didn't turn around. "Hey," Rafe stepped closer, addressing her back. "I'm talking to you. What's your assignment here?" She completed her stance check, then looked over her shoulder at him. "I'm a Navy SEAL." The laughter that followed was louder this time. Rafe let it build for a moment before raising a hand to quiet it. Not because he wanted to stop the joke, but because he wanted to own the room before continuing. "A SEAL," he repeated. He walked a slow half-circle around her, performing for the audience that had already begun to gather. "You know what SEALs look like. I've trained with SEALs. You don't look like someone who'd survive what they go through." "The paperwork disagrees," Keira said. More laughter. Different this time. Uncertain. A few soldiers exchanged glances. Rafe's jaw tightened, but he kept his smile in place. He reached out and grabbed the collar of her uniform, not violently, but with the casual authority of someone who had never been told he couldn't. It was a dominance gesture, nothing more. A way of making her small in front of people who were watching. "Battlefields aren't built for someone your size," he said. "No offense." Keira looked at the hand on her collar. Then she looked at him. She said nothing. After a moment, Rafe released her and stepped back, satisfied. He had made his point. He turned back toward his audience and the moment moved on. But Keira had already begun her work. While she competed in the remaining stations, dispatching each opponent with clean, efficient technique that drew first silence and then reluctant attention from the crowd, she positioned herself during rest intervals where she could see Rafe. Not his face, his body. The way his left shoulder loaded when a training partner pushed back harder than expected. The way his weight transferred a half-beat before he committed to a strike. The way his breathing changed when something wasn't going the way he'd planned. She watched him the way she had been trained to watch. Not for what a person showed, but for what they couldn't help revealing. By the time the afternoon session began, she had seen the pattern repeat 3 times. The left shoulder. Always the left shoulder. It rose a fraction of a second before the strike. Not enough for most people to catch. Enough for her. She filed it away without expression and moved to her next station. Around her, the crowd had stopped laughing. They weren't cheering yet, but they had stopped laughing. Word moved through the gathered soldiers in the quiet way information moves when no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Whoever this woman was, she was not what they had assumed. Rafe felt it, and he did not like what he felt. The final bout was posted at 4:15 in the afternoon. A soldier with a clipboard walked the length of the gathered crowd and pinned the bracket to the board mounted near the entrance of the combat area. People moved toward it in clusters. Then the clusters went quiet. Special Assessment Bout Full Observation / Vale K versus Calloway R / 0. 800 hours. Main mat. Mandatory attendance. Rafe saw it at the same time as everyone else. He stood in front of the board for a moment, then turned to the soldiers nearest him and smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the outcome is already decided. "Good," he said. "She wanted to be here. Now she'll understand what that costs." The comment spread across the base before dinner. Commander Navarro found Keira at the equipment locker an hour later. She didn't approach with sympathy or alarm. She came the way she did everything, directly, with information. "You know what he said," Navarro told her. It wasn't a question. "I heard." "He doesn't just want to win." Navarro kept her voice level. "He wants to take something from you in front of everyone here. That's different. You need to understand the difference before you step on that mat." Keira folded her training wrap and set it on the bench. "I already know what he is." "Then know this too." Navarro glanced toward the corridor, then back. "I've watched him spar for 3 years. I've logged it. When he's losing face in front of an audience, he loads his left shoulder before he commits to a strike. Every time. It's not a tell he controls anymore. It's reflex. He'll load before a clean attack, and he'll load before a dirty one. The difference is that a dirty one, he'll try to hide behind his body first." Keira was quiet for a moment. "You've never told anyone that." "I've never had a reason to," Navarro said. "Until now." It was Corporal Mason Ivers who came to her next, just after lights out in the narrow hallway outside the overnight quarters. He looked like someone who had rehearsed the conversation 3 times and was still not sure he should be having it. "Sergeant Calloway," Mason said. "There was a training session about 8 months ago. Closed room, no official observers. A junior recruit left with a hyperextended knee and 2 cracked ribs." He stopped. "It was logged as an accident." "It wasn't." Keira looked at him. "You were there." "I was right outside. I heard it," he swallowed. He said before the session, not to me, to someone else, but loud enough that the recruit needed to learn what real pressure felt like. Mason's voice didn't waver, but his hands were still. He said it like it was training. It wasn't training. "Why are you telling me this now?" Mason met her eyes. "Because tomorrow, you're the recruit." Keira stood in the hallway after he left and let the full shape of it settle. She had 2 choices. She could withdraw, request a medical deferral, cite, scheduling, find a clean exit that left her record untouched and her body intact. No one with any sense would blame her. Rafe was bigger, had home advantage. Had 600 people already half convinced of the outcome, and had demonstrated a willingness to cause real harm when his ego required it. Or she could walk onto that mat tomorrow morning, with everything she had gathered: Navarro's observation, her own pattern recognition, the understanding of exactly what kind of man she was facing, and she could let the truth do what arguments never could. She went to her bunk. She did not request a deferral. The sun was already pressing hard against the desert floor when the main mat filled at 8 o'clock the following morning. 600 personnel arranged themselves around the combat area, in the particular way crowds arrange themselves when they expect something significant. Front rows tight, back rows elevated on benches and equipment crates. The whole mass of them pressing inward like a single held breath. The red sand had been raked flat overnight. The unit flags along the perimeter stood rigid in a wind that had turned hot before the hour. Heat bounced off the steel fencing in visible waves. Master Sergeant Orland Pierce stood at the mat's edge with a clipboard and a whistle. His expression the practiced neutral of someone whose job required him to appear impartial, regardless of what he actually believed. Colonel Brenna Sykes sat elevated in the observation tower to the north, legal pad open, pen uncapped. Commander Navarro stood near the eastern entrance, arms crossed, watching the crowd as much as the mat. Corporal Mason Ivers had positioned himself in the second row on the western side, close enough to see clearly, far enough back to avoid drawing attention. Rafe Calloway entered from the south corridor to a sound that was less a cheer and more a pressure wave, the collective noise of people who had already decided what they were there to witness. He was in full training gear, moving with the loose-limbed ease of a man who had done this many times and expected this time to be no different. He pulled off his gloves and held them at his side. He rolled his neck once slowly, performing for the people watching him perform. Then he looked across the mat at Keira Vale and smiled. Keira entered from the north without ceremony. She had her hair pulled back, her gear fitted close, her expression the same as it had been the day before, still inward, giving nothing to the crowd that surrounded her. She stopped at her starting position and took one slow breath. She did not look at Rafe's face. She looked at his left shoulder. Pierce raised the whistle. The crowd quieted to something just below silence. Then the signal came, and Rafe moved. He came fast, faster than the crowd expected. Fast enough that a ripple of sound moved through the gathered soldiers in the first 3 seconds. He was not pacing himself. He came with his full weight behind the first approach, driving forward with his right side leading, trying to establish immediate physical dominance and compress Keira into the boundary line before she could set her feet. Keira moved backward, not stumbling, not retreating in panic. She moved in measured steps, absorbing the pressure without absorbing the impact, keeping her center low, keeping her eyes off his face and on the mechanics of his movement. Her back foot found the edge marker, and she redirected a quarter turn left, letting his momentum carry him past her position, rather than meeting it directly. Rafe adjusted and came again. The crowd began to read the visible surface of the exchange. A large man driving forward a smaller woman, giving ground. From the outside, it looked like pressure becoming inevitable. Voices lifted from the gathered soldiers, not cruel exactly, but certain. The certainty of people watching something confirm what they already believed. Keira let them watch. She was not retreating. She was testing. Every time Rafe drove forward and she yielded, she was measuring the degree of shoulder rotation before commitment, the weight transfer in his rear foot, the way his chin dropped a fraction when he expected contact and didn't get it. Navarro had told her the left shoulder was the tell. That was borrowed information. Keira did not fight on borrowed information alone. She needed to see it herself 3 times at minimum before she would stake a joint on it. First approach, Rafe's left shoulder had lifted slightly before he planted for the drive. Slight, possibly incidental. Second approach, the shoulder again more pronounced. His weight had loaded left before the right side push. The tell was real. Third approach, Rafe feinted right and drove left, the shoulder loaded a full half-second before his body committed. It was not a subtle movement. It was a door left open by a man who had never faced anyone patient enough to wait for it. Confirmed. 3 times. The answer to the question that had opened this story was assembling itself in real time on red sand in front of 600 people who had no idea they were watching it happen. Keira filed it and kept moving. The crowd's noise had shifted. What started as confident murmuring had developed an edge of uncertainty. Rafe was landing nothing. He was generating impact but not contact force, but not effect. His approaches were meeting empty space. The soldiers who had come expecting a short and conclusive exchange were beginning to recalculate. Rafe felt the shift before he understood it. He pulled back from his fourth approach and stood at center mat, chest moving with controlled effort, watching Keira reset to her position. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't favoring any side. She looked exactly as composed as she had when she walked onto the mat. And that fact, more than any strike she had or hadn't thrown, was the thing that reached past Rafe's confidence and found something less steady underneath. He had expected fear. He had expected her to tighten, to overcommit, out of desperation to make the mistake that size and pressure usually produced in people who hadn't prepared for both. She hadn't done any of those things. She had simply moved and watched and refused to give him anything to use, which meant he would need to change his approach. He rolled his left shoulder once, the same automatic gesture he made before shifting to a more aggressive attack pattern and started forward again. Keira saw the shoulder move. She had seen enough. The change happened between one breath and the next. Keira stopped retreating. She didn't announce it. She didn't shift her stance dramatically or signal the transition in any way the crowd could immediately read. She simply stopped giving ground, and in doing so, changed the entire geometry of the fight. Rafe came forward on his fifth approach, expecting the same yielding pattern he had established over the previous minutes. Instead, he found Keira moving toward him, not charging, not aggressive, but stepping into the space he was trying to occupy, angling her body so that his forward drive found no clean surface to push against. He had been fighting a wall that kept moving backward. Suddenly, the wall had disappeared, and he was moving through open air with his weight fully committed and nowhere to deposit it. His momentum carried him past her left side. Keira turned with him, one hand making brief controlled contact with his forearm, enough to extend his rotation by a fraction, enough to ensure his planted foot bore the full consequence of his own speed. Rafe stumbled, caught himself, turned back. He was upright. He had not gone down. But the recovery had cost him something. Visible. A half-second of lost composure. A slight widening of the eyes before his expression reset. The crowd felt it. A different sound moved through the 600, not the confident noise from the early minutes, but something quieter and more attentive. The kind of sound a room makes when it realizes it may have misjudged what it was watching. Rafe reset its center and came again, harder. This time, Keira moved at the moment of commitment, rather than before it, waiting until his weight was fully transferred, until the point at which a strike either lands or exposes the striker. And then, stepping inside the arc of his arm, turning her shoulder into his chest and redirecting his energy downward and to the right. Rafe's feet left the mat for a fraction of a second. He landed on both feet, just barely, but the recovery was visible to everyone watching. The crowd went genuinely quiet. This was the thing Rafe had not prepared for and could not easily name. Keira was not fighting him. She was using him. Every pound of force he generated, every ounce of speed he committed, was being received and redirected, not blocked, not absorbed, but turned into a problem for him rather than for her. The harder he pushed, the more efficiently she answered. Rafe's jaw set. His breathing was audible now. What was eating at him was not the physical challenge. He had faced physical challenges. It was the expression on her face, or rather, the absence of one. Keira was not angry. She was not frightened. She was not performing for the crowd the way he performed, feeding off their energy, drawing confidence from their noise. She looked like someone solving a problem she had already solved once before, going through the steps a second time to confirm the answer. She was not trying to beat him. She was demonstrating something. He had called her too small to survive a battlefield. He had grabbed her collar in front of 600 people and expected her to flinch, to shrink, to give him the reaction he needed to confirm what he already believed. She had given him nothing. And now, on a mat in front of those same 600 people, she was showing without a word, without a speech, without a single gesture toward the crowd, that the thing he had mistaken for smallness was precision, and that precision, applied correctly, made his size irrelevant. This was what the crowd was watching. This was what they were beginning to understand. The man who had arrived on the mat as a certainty was becoming a question. The woman who had arrived as a curiosity was becoming the answer. Rafe pressed forward again, this time abandoning technique almost entirely, relying on sheer mass and speed to close the distance before Keira could set her angle. It almost worked. His right hand caught her shoulder and pushed, not a clean strike, but enough to drive her back 2 steps and reset the space between them. The crowd reacted. Several voices lifted. Rafe straightened and let the sound reach him. Let it refuel what the previous exchanges had drained. But Keira had already reset. She was balanced, unhurried, watching him. And she had noticed something new. The near contact had cost Rafe something he hadn't intended to spend. Control. His left shoulder had loaded 3 times in the last 4 exchanges, each repetition more pronounced than the last. Under physical exertion and mounting frustration, the habit was deepening. He was not getting harder to read. He was getting easier. Mason Ivers, watching from the second row, had started watching Rafe's left shoulder too. Not because he understood the full significance, but because he had been around this man long enough to know that when that shoulder moved like that, something was about to go wrong for whoever was standing in front of him. Whatever was coming, it was close. The shift in Rafe's approach was subtle enough that most of the crowd didn't catch it immediately. He stopped trying to overpower her cleanly. The first sign was a shoulder check after Pierce's whistle signaled a brief reset, not violent enough to draw an official response, but deliberate. Rafe's shoulder caught Keira on the upper arm as he moved past her to his starting position, and he didn't acknowledge it. Didn't look back. Just walked to his mark like it hadn't happened. Keira rolled the arm once and reset. The second sign came a minute later, during a close exchange, when Rafe said something under his breath too low for the nearest observer to parse, but directed precisely at Keira. His lips barely moved. She heard it. She gave him nothing in return. No change in expression, no shift in posture, no indication that the words had reached her at all. Which was exactly the right response, and exactly the thing that made him angrier. What Rafe was doing was not new. It was a specific kind of pressure, the kind designed not to damage the body, but to destabilize the mind. You made the opponent feel unsafe, unwelcome, targeted in ways that couldn't be officially documented. You made them angry, or frightened, or self-conscious. And then you let those emotions make the mistakes for you. He was good at it. It had always worked before. It required the target to care what he thought of them. Keira did not care what Rafe Calloway thought of her. She had made that decision long before she set foot on this base, and nothing that had happened in the past 24 hours had given her any reason to revise it. His words were noise. His shoulder check was data confirmation that he was shifting tactics because the direct approach had failed. But the pressure was not only coming from Rafe. He had begun maneuvering her toward the western corner of the mat, the quadrant farthest from Pierce's primary observation position, partially obscured from 2 of the 4 elevated camera angles by the angle of the morning sun. It was not accidental. He was creating geography, reducing the number of eyes that had a clean view of what he was about to do. Keira recognized the geometry. She moved to correct it twice, redirecting back toward the center of the mat through her footwork, and both times Rafe cut her off, using his body as a barrier rather than a weapon, hurting rather than striking. She let him move her, not because she had no choice, but because she understood that the move he was setting up would only come if he believed he had created the right conditions for it. If she fought the positioning too hard, he would recognize that she had anticipated the setup and changed the plan. Better to let him believe the trap was working. Better to let him arrive at the moment he had been building toward, because she needed him to throw that strike. She needed it witnessed, documented, and unambiguous. Mason Ivers had lost his clean line of sight when the action moved to the western corner. He stepped sideways along the boundary, trying to re-establish his angle, and felt the crowd press back against him. He could see enough. He could see Rafe's left shoulder loading and releasing, in shorter, more compressed cycles, the mechanical repetition of a man whose body had already decided what it was going to do and was simply waiting for the moment to execute. He opened his mouth. The crowd noise closed around the sound before it left him. At the mat's edge, Master Sergeant Pierce had noticed the drift toward the western corner. He had seen Rafe use corners before to reduce visibility to operate in reduced oversight. Pierce had allowed it twice before in closed sessions and told himself it was within the margin of acceptable aggression. He was not going to tell himself that again. He began moving along the mat's boundary, repositioning toward the western side, quietly and deliberately, the way a man moves when he wants to be in the right place before something happens. He was not quite close enough yet. On the elevated platform, Colonel Sykes had set down her pen. She was watching the western corner, with both hands flat on the rail in front of her. Commander Navarro had moved from the eastern entrance to the southern boundary, without being fully conscious of doing so. She had given Keira the information she had. Whatever happened in the next 30 seconds was beyond her reach. Inside the western corner, Rafe rolled his left shoulder. Once, a slow, deliberate rotation. The same gesture Keira had seen him make before, escalating to full-force attacks. But this time, the rotation didn't lead into a standard approach. He dropped his chin. His weight shifted backward. His eyes went unfocused. In the way eyes go unfocused when a person is no longer watching their opponent, but watching the moment they've chosen. He was done with the sparring. Keira felt the change in the air before she could fully articulate it. The pressure of 600 people and the noise of the desert wind and the heat bouncing off the steel fencing all compressed down to a single point of attention. The left shoulder in front of her loading, with a tension that was different from every previous load. Slower, deeper, final. She had spent the last 40 minutes preparing for this moment. She knew which direction the strike was coming from. She knew the angle. She knew the target. She took one breath. She waited. Rafe made his move in 2 stages. The first stage was theater. He let his shoulders drop. His breathing slowed and became audible. The deliberate exhale of a man signaling fatigue, manufacturing the impression that the exchange had cost him more than he wanted to admit. He took 2 steps backward, away from Keira, toward the center of the mat. His hands came down slightly from their guard position, his chin lifted. To 600 people watching from outside the boundary, it looked like a fighter taking a moment to recover. To Pierce, still moving along the western edge, it looked wrong. To Keira, it looked exactly like what it was. She had seen this pattern before. Not from Rafe specifically, but from the category of fighter he represented. The performed retreat. The manufactured opening. The invitation extended to an opponent to close the distance to come forward, to put themselves in the space the retreating fighter was actually targeting. It worked reliably against people who read the surface of a situation. It did not work against people who read what was underneath. She did not move forward. She held her position and watched his left shoulder. Rafe waited 2 seconds. When Keira didn't advance, something crossed his face, brief, involuntary. The expression of a man whose plan required a response that hadn't come. He covered it quickly. Then he committed. He drove forward from his back foot with his full body weight behind the movement, his right shoulder dropping as a false indicator, his body angling to place himself between Keira and Pierce's line of sight. In one continuous motion, he brought his right side forward to occupy the space in front of her, while his left leg swung low and fast toward the side of her right knee. A strike designed to hyperextend the joint from the lateral side, the kind that ended careers, and sometimes ended more than careers. His left shoulder had loaded a full half-second before his body committed. Keira was already moving, not backward, not sideways. Into him, a single, controlled step that placed her inside the arc of his sweep before it reached full extension, collapsing the distance he needed to generate force. Her right hand found his forearm at the moment of maximum commitment, not gripping, but guiding, redirecting the rotational energy of his swing along a line that bypassed her knee entirely. Her left hand dropped to his ankle, the planted foot, the one bearing all of his weight and all of his momentum. And she did not pull so much as she removed the support. A precise and economical motion that had exactly one consequence. Rafe's weight fully committed to a strike that had found nothing to land on, had nowhere to go but down. He went down hard. The red sand came up fast, and he hit it with his full mass, right side first, the impact sending a visible shock wave through his shoulder and torso. He lay still for a fraction of a second, not unconscious, but genuinely unable to process the sequence of events that had produced this outcome. Then he tried to stand. His right arm buckled. He tried again. His body had taken the full consequence of its own force, and it was not prepared to answer the demand he was placing on it. He made it to one knee, stayed there, and did not rise further. The sound from the crowd was not a cheer. It was something harder to categorize. A collective exhalation from 600 people simultaneously revising what they thought they knew. The noise of an assumption collapsing in real time, in front of witnesses without warning. Pierce reached the mat boundary in 3 fast strides and blew the whistle twice sharp, the signal that ended an exchange under conditions requiring official review. He stepped onto the mat before the second echo died, planting himself between the 2 combatants, with the flat authority of a man who had decided somewhere in the last 40 seconds that he was not going to be on the wrong side of this twice. "Hold," he said. His voice carried across the entire mat. Keira stood where she had completed the technique. She had not stepped back. She had not looked at the crowd. Her hands were at her sides. Her breathing was measured and slow, and she was watching Rafe with the same focused attention she had given him from the moment the bout began. Not with satisfaction, not with contempt, but with the careful, observational discipline of someone who had not yet confirmed that the situation was fully resolved. Colonel Sykes was on her feet in the observation tower, both hands on the rail. Commander Navarro had not moved from her position, but her arms had come uncrossed. Mason Ivers was standing at the mat's edge with his hands pressed flat against the boundary rope. The words he had tried to shout still sitting unused in his chest. Rafe looked up from the ground at the 600 people surrounding him. He found none of the faces he was looking for. The crowd was watching him, but not the way it usually did. It was watching him the way people watch something they're trying to understand. Keira did not look at the crowd. She did not raise her hands. She did not do anything at all except stand in the red desert sand in the hard morning light, breathing steadily, waiting for whatever came next. She had known the move was coming. She had been ready. That was all. Rafe was helped off the mat by 2 soldiers from his unit. He didn't speak as they walked him toward the medical station at the base's eastern edge. He didn't look back at the combat area. His right arm was held close to his body, his jaw set in the particular way jaws set when a person is using physical pain to avoid thinking about something worse. Pierce remained on the mat and formally suspended the bout pending official review. He said it clearly, loud enough for the crowd to hear, and his voice carried no apology and no ambiguity. Then he turned to the 2 nearest observation officers and requested that all recording equipment, fixed cameras, mobile units, the elevated tower feed, be secured immediately and logged for the review committee. It was the first thing he had done in 3 years that did not protect Rafe Calloway. The crowd dispersed slowly in the way crowds disperse when they don't want to be the first to leave, because leaving means missing whatever comes next. Small clusters formed at the edges of the combat area, voices low, people leaning toward each other with the compressed energy of a base trying to process something it hadn't prepared for. Within the hour, the phones came out. Footage from at least a dozen personal devices had captured portions of the bout from different angles. Clips moved across the base's informal networks before the official review committee had finished its first meeting. By mid-afternoon, several versions were circulating, some cut from the moment of the takedown, only stripped of context. Others were longer, but still partial. None of them told the whole story. All of them told enough of it to generate an opinion. 2 camps formed before dinner. The first said Keira had used excessive force, that she had escalated beyond the requirements of the situation. Several of the voices in this camp were people who had watched Rafe win bouts on this mat for years and had organized their understanding of what strength looked like around that image. Dismantling the image required dismantling something in themselves, and that was harder than reassigning fault. The second camp had found a different frame entirely. They were treating Keira as a symbol, sharing the clips with captions that turned her into a statement, a headline, a proof of something larger than the specific events of a specific morning. They weren't wrong about what she represented, but they were doing it without her permission, and in ways she would not have chosen. Keira heard about both camps from Commander Navarro that evening. She sat across from Navarro in the commander's office and listened without interrupting until Navarro finished. "I don't want either one of those," Keira said. "I know." "He threw an illegal strike at my knee. I responded within the required parameters. That's the complete story." "It will be," Navarro said, "if the camera footage shows what I believe it shows." Colonel Sykes had formally opened a conduct review by late afternoon. She had requested the complete camera record from all fixed and mobile sources, written statements from both combatants, and testimony from the officiating and observation personnel present at the bout. The scope of the review extended to include the incident from 8 months prior that had been logged as an accident. Mason's report had reached Sykes through Pierce, who had delivered it himself without being asked. It was the second thing Pierce had done that surprised the people who thought they knew him. Rafe, interviewed by the review committee that evening, denied that the sweep had been intentional. He said the bout had been competitive and physical, that he had been attempting a standard low attack, and that the outcome was the result of Keira's disproportionate response. His voice was steady. His account was organized, but he could not account for the geometry. He could not explain why his body had been positioned precisely between Keira and the primary observer's line of sight at the moment of the strike. He could not explain why the angle of his leg sweep was directed at the lateral side of her knee, rather than at her base or center of gravity, as a standard low attack would require. He answered every question he was asked. The questions he wasn't asked were the ones that would matter. Keira returned to her overnight quarters and sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark for a long time. Outside, the desert had gone quiet in the way deserts go quiet at night. Not empty, but settled. Everything that had been loud in the heat now folded into stillness. She had done what she came to do. Whether the institution was prepared to see it clearly was not something she could control. She lay down and closed her eyes and waited for morning. The camera footage from the observation tower was presented to the full review committee on the third morning. The tower feed covered the western corner of the mat from an elevated northeast angle, the one position that Rafe's body geometry had not successfully blocked. It showed everything. It showed the performed retreat, the false fatigue, the deliberate repositioning of his body between Keira and Pierce's ground-level line of sight. It showed the left shoulder loading. It showed the angle of the sweep not toward her base, not toward her center, but directed precisely at the lateral side of her right knee, with the full rotational force of his committed body weight behind it. It showed Keira's response, a single controlled step into the strike's arc, a redirection at the point of maximum commitment, a precise removal of his planted foot's support. Nothing excessive, nothing retaliatory. A technique that used exactly the force the situation required, and stopped at the exact point where the situation was resolved. The committee watched the footage twice. On the second viewing, no one spoke. Pierce submitted his written statement that same morning. He described what he had observed from his position on the mat's boundary, the shoulder checks after the reset whistle, the deliberate drift toward the western corner, the geometry of the final approach. He documented it in the flat, precise language of official reporting, without editorial comment, without apology, for the 3 years during which he had allowed a different standard to operate on his mat. Mason Ivers gave his testimony in a small room off the main corridor, with Colonel Sykes and one other committee member present. He was 22 years old, and he sat in the chair with his hands flat on his thighs, and he did not look anywhere except at the person asking him questions. He told them what Rafe had said before the bout, the specific words spoken to another soldier, but loud enough to carry, that Keira would not leave the mat on her own feet. He told them about the closed training session 8 months prior, what he had heard from outside the door, what the junior recruit had looked like afterward. He told them that he had not reported it at the time because he had not believed a report would be received without consequences for the person making it. He said all of it without hedging. When Sykes asked him why he was willing to say it now, Mason was quiet for a moment. "Because she got on the mat anyway," he said, knowing what he was. "She got on the mat anyway, so I can sit in a chair and tell the truth." Commander Navarro's testimony was the final piece. She confirmed that she had shared her observations about Rafe's tactical habits with Keira prior to the bout, his tendency to load his left shoulder before committing to an attack under pressure. She explained her reasoning that she was responsible for the personnel she had placed on that mat, that she had information relevant to their safety, and that withholding it from a combatant she believed was facing a genuine physical risk would have been a failure of her duty. She did not apologize for the conversation. She described it accurately and let the committee determine its significance. With those three testimonies, Pierce's documentation, Mason's witness account, and Navarro's confirmation, the full picture was complete. The hook this story opened with now had its answer. Keira had known the move was coming because Navarro had told her what to look for. Because she had spent 30 minutes on that mat confirming it was true. And because she had been patient enough to wait for the moment Rafe could no longer stop himself from doing exactly what she expected. The committee's findings were issued that afternoon. Rafe Calloway's technique was determined to have been an illegal strike directed at a vulnerable joint, executed with deliberate intent, and positioned to reduce official visibility. He was suspended from his training role immediately, pending a full command-level conduct review and mandatory psychological assessment for leadership fitness. Keira's response was formally classified as a lawful defensive technique applied within the boundaries of proportionate force. She was informed of the findings by Navarro in the same office where they had spoken 3 evenings before. She read the document once, set it on the desk, and said nothing for a moment. "It's what happened," she said finally. "Yes," Navarro said. "It is." The base's internal media office requested a brief statement from Keira that afternoon. A young staff sergeant with a recorder asked her what she wanted to say to the people who had doubted her. Keira considered the question. "I didn't come here to be believed," she said. "I came here to complete the mission." The staff sergeant wrote it down. He looked up. "That's it?" "That's it." It was 6 words. It moved through Eagle Mesa the way true things move. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, finding its way into conversations in the mess hall and the training corridors, where soldiers talked honestly about the things that actually mattered. Colonel Sykes, reviewing her notes before returning to her headquarters, added a single line to her evaluation of Eagle Mesa's training program. Curriculum revision required. Recommend external instruction, first session, force control and command ethics. Instructor recommendation to follow. She already knew who she was going to recommend. She had known since the moment Keira Vale stood in the red sand and did not raise her hands. 3 months later, Eagle Mesa looked the same from the highway. The red rock desert stretched flat and indifferent in every direction, the base rising out of it in hard angles and pale concrete. The steel fencing catching the afternoon light the way it always had. The unit flags were up. The sand on the main combat area had been raked. The heat was the same heat, the kind that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize. Keira drove in from the north this time. She had no orders in her chest pocket. She had an invitation formally issued by Colonel Sykes' office describing her role as lead instructor for Eagle Mesa's inaugural Force Control and Command Ethics curriculum. A 2-day program. Mandatory attendance for all training personnel. Open observation for any enlisted soldier who wanted to be there. 614 personnel showed up. Keira stood at the front of the main combat area, in the same place she had stood 3 months before, in the same morning light, facing the same arrangement of faces. Some of those faces she recognized. Most she didn't. All of them were watching her with a quality of attention that was different from the first time, less certain of what they were about to see, more willing to find out. She did not begin with her biography. She did not begin with what had happened on this mat. She began with a question. "What's the difference," she said, "between force and strength?" She let the question sit in the morning air for a moment. Then she began to teach. The first session covered force mechanics, how size and mass interacted with timing and leverage, why the combatant with less physical power could consistently neutralize a larger opponent through positional discipline. How the instinct to overpower was often the primary obstacle to effective technique. She demonstrated with volunteers. She was precise, methodical, and unhurried. She corrected without condescension. When a young corporal executed a redirection technique cleanly on his second attempt, she told him it was well done, and meant it. In the afternoon, she moved to the ethics component. She talked about authority, what it was, for how it could be used to protect the people under it, or to exploit them, and how the difference between those two outcomes was not always visible from the outside, until it was too late to matter. She talked about the cost of cultures that protected performance over conduct, that allowed patterns of harm to persist because the person at the center of those patterns was useful to someone with rank. She did not mention Rafe by name. She did not need to. At the end of the second day, after the formal curriculum had concluded, and most of the group had begun to disperse, a figure appeared at the back of the seating area. Rafe Calloway had come, without announcement. He was in civilian clothes. No rank, no uniform insignia, none of the visible markers of the role he no longer held. The particular quality of his presence had changed, the occupied space confidence he had always carried. The sense that he took up more room than his physical dimensions required was gone. What remained was just a man, standing at the back of a room, waiting to see if he would be permitted to approach. Keira saw him. She finished her conversation with the two soldiers she had been speaking with, thanked them, and walked to the back of the seating area. She stopped a few feet from Rafe and waited. He didn't make a speech. He didn't perform contrition for an audience, though several people nearby had gone still. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was level and quiet. "About you. About what I thought strength meant. About what I did on that mat, and what I did in that training room 8 months before." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know that's not yours to give on a timeline I set. I just needed to say it where people could hear it. Because I said the other thing where people could hear it, and that has to be answered the same way." Keira looked at him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. Rafe took it. The handshake was brief and unembellished. No performance, no theater. Two people acknowledging a truth that had cost something to reach. The soldiers who had stayed and witnessed it did not cheer. They stood in the kind of silence that forms when something real has happened. Not a victory, not a resolution, but a beginning. The quiet acknowledgement that the hardest lessons rarely arrive loudly. Keira walked out of the combat area into the late afternoon light. The desert was copper and gold around her, the shadows long, the air beginning to release the day's heat into the cooling sky. She did not look back. She had finished what she came to do. Real strength isn't the loudest voice in the room or the biggest presence on the mat. It's the ability to stay controlled when everything around you is pushing for a reaction. It's the discipline to let your actions speak when words would only give someone else ammunition. And sometimes it's the courage to stand in front of the people who doubted you, not to say, "I told you so," but to say, "Here's what I know, and here's how it might help you." Keira didn't walk onto that mat to prove a point. She walked on because the mission required it. That distinction between performing strength and living it is one worth sitting with. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, people who held the line quietly, who let their preparation speak, who didn't need the crowd's permission to know their own worth. That's what this channel is built around. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.